Greetings from Garmisch and welcome back to the Marshall Center Voices. I'm Valbona Zeneli. Today I have the great pleasure to introduce a very special session. We gathered at the Marshall Center at the end of August with members of parliament from countries in the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe to talk about the importance of effective, transparent, and accountable legislators. I was excited to have a very insightful conversation with Congressman Gerry Connolly, a member of the House Democracy Partnership and the president of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly. We discussed important issues of the strategic alliance in a world of great power competition. Congressman Connolly, welcome to the Marshall Center.
Thank you.
We're delighted to have you at the Marshall Center Voices with us.
And I'm delighted to be here, and I'm even wearing my Marshall Center pin.
Thank you so much. In addition to representing the people of Northern Virginia at the U.S. Congress, you also serve as a member of the House Democracy Partnership, which is a bipartisan commission that supports capacity building of partner nations' legislative bodies all around the world. You are a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and currently, you are the president of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly. This is an affiliate organization of NATO that's comprised of 250 delegates,
At least, yeah.
Both from NATO countries, 30 member NATO countries, but also partner.
That's right.
So in this capacity, you set the agenda, the broader agenda of the Assembly, focusing on supporting the Transatlantic Alliance and strengthen also the U.S. commitment for NATO. Would you say that this project is similar to the House Democracy Partnership, with the only difference that is focused more on NATO's core pillars, which are collective defense and shared democratic values?
Oh, I think there is some overlap, but I think the NATO responsibilities, frankly, are very focused, and that is on strengthening the transatlantic alliance. And we're going through the process now of updating the strategic concept for NATO. And, you know, if you think about it, the last time we had a strategic concept about a decade ago, there's not a single mention of China. It doesn't exist, apparently. No mention at all. And Russia is still seen as a strategic partner. So a lot's changed, and there's a lot of catch up to do. And I also think we have to recognize that there's, frankly, an assault on democracy that NATO has to take cognizance of, both within democratic societies and from without.
You mentioned NATO 2030. Actually, there was a reflection group of NATO. I'll be curious to know, what was the role of the Assembly in giving suggestions to the reflection group? And also based on what we have seen in the last 10 years, what are some of the lessons learned and what is the future of NATO? Mm-hmm.
So I think I'll start with China. Being realistic about the fact that even though it's not in the European transatlantic theater, China is a rising power that needs to be paid attention to. There are opportunities with China, but there are also some real threats. China is an autocratic society with a communist government that directly is challenging the whole underpinnings of democracy in the North Atlantic Alliance. And we need to rise to meet that threat forcefully. I don't mean militarily necessarily, but I mean, we have to be robust and vigorous in our response to that challenge. And it's a challenge that is economic and military and political and even cyber related by China. And so we need to recognize that China is here. It's in our theater. It is aggressive. President Xi is not going to hide and slide the way, say, Deng Xiaoping did. He is bold and aggressive and in your face. And we see that not only in the South China Sea, but we see it with the One Belt, One Road initiative. We see it in the high north and the Arctic, which most certainly, that's right, 17+1. I mean, they are everywhere, and we need to respond to that.
We have seen actually an increased investment of Chinese, both state-owned enterprises and private companies in Europe.
That's right.
Looks like it's wakening up also.
That's right. And that even extends to things like economic dependence. What the pandemic has exposed is our over-reliance on single source or limited source supply chains. So China was the world's #1 supplier of PPE during the pandemic, face masks and gowns and gloves. Well, what can go wrong with being overly dependent on China for that, especially when the virus outbreak began in China? Likewise, for critical pharmaceutical ingredients and antibiotics and other important drugs, we're overly reliant on China and India for those medications. And so the need to diversify and be a lot less reliant on one or two suppliers, I think, is another lesson we've learned, and it directly affects national security and collective security. But the other big thing that, going back to your question about what's our input, the Assembly's input, I think really is a discussion about how do we move beyond the aspirational when we talk about building democracy and democratic societies. How do we try to create a structure within NATO that is a resource for our members and for prospective members? A resource that's a clearinghouse that does benchmarking, is the repository for best practices. Where do you go to try to find out, well, how do I make sure that I've got an independent judiciary? And so we want to have that happen within NATO headquarters itself, not an outside center of excellence, but that ought to be enshrined as a function within NATO itself. After 70 years, we think it's time. And as I like to say, we've got many parts of NATO physically that are dedicated to military operations and military interoperability and equipping and purchasing and weapon systems and strategic planning. There's not even a closet at the brand new headquarters in Brussels dedicated to building democracy, and that's got to change.
In fact, I read in one of your opinion pieces for The Hill that you point out that defending democracy should be one of NATO's core pillars going forward.
Absolutely. To me, that's every bit as important as collective security, because if you're going to defeat the malign activities and ideas of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, you have to have a shiny, working, successful, robust alternative model in democracy. And that's the biggest threat to both of them.
Especially that we're seeing some democratic backsliding.
Absolutely, and that we have to guard against as well. Because if we aren't about the promotion and development of democratic institutions, then we're just another military bloc that just doesn't like the Russians and Chinese.
I agree. So you mentioned both Russia and China. There's talk out there about alliances between Russia and China. Is it fact or fiction?
Well, I think there is de facto cooperation out of necessity right now. There's no question about that. But, history doesn't turn on a dime. And the long-time rivalries between the Chinese and the Russians did not disappear. And I'm going to predict that they will resurface over time. Right now, they have common cause. They both are feeling a little bit isolated and under siege. Russia maybe more than China. And why not collaborate so that we pose an even bigger challenge and threat to our adversaries or would-be adversaries. And I will see, but my guess is that's going to be more of a short-term relationship of convenience than it is a strategic partnership that will be lasting. But you never know.
You are one of the key players when it comes to strengthening transatlantic relations in the U.S. foreign policy. In the last virtual Munich Security Conference, President Biden mentioned that America is back. So how do you see the transatlantic relations going forward?
I think there's candidly been a lot of damage done in the previous 4 years, not least of which was psychological in terms of what's happened to the necessary, essential partner in the transatlantic alliance, the United States. And so I think when he says we're back, he's also signaling we're going to repair a lot of that damage. We're going to reverse a lot of those policies that we felt were injurious, frankly, to the alliance. And I think Joe Biden brings a lot of credibility to it. I'm the only former Biden staffer in the Congress. I was hired to be on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by a young, up-and-coming senator from Delaware named Joe Biden Jr., And he went on to become the chairman of the European Affairs Subcommittee on the Foreign Relations Committee when I was there, and took a deep and abiding interest in the alliance and in NATO specifically. So when he says that, it has some credibility, and because he means it, and he's committed, and he's got a 36-year record in the Senate of showing that commitment. So I hope that is reassuring for our allies, but at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. And I think the United States is going to have to show that it really is that reliable partner, and it is going to exercise consultative leadership, and it is going to work with our partners to reinvigorate the alliance and meet the very real challenges we face.
Mm-hmm. In the bigger scheme, are we perhaps overlooking the importance of the transatlantic economy, which is the biggest in the world, in the global economy, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of investments? What can we do to improve also economic relations in the transatlantic economy?
Yeah, I think the last 5 or 6 years have sadly been a story of missed opportunities. So when the Trans-Pacific Partnership fell apart in the United States Congress, a terrible missed opportunity from my point of view that just created a vacuum for the Chinese to fill enormously. That also then meant that TTIP and the European North Atlantic trade agreement was also going to probably fall, and did. So,
very close to getting concluded.
Absolutely, but they were kind of moving in tandem. So free trade kind of took a holiday in Washington, and it's a prolonged and troublesome holiday, if I can say. We have to rebuild the political consensus, however, on free trade, and we have to persuade ordinary Americans and Europeans, in this case, that free trade actually works in your benefit. And right now, that's not the case. Many people feel free trade is the opposite. It costs communities jobs and investment in manufacturing plants, and that's a narrative that must be addressed and hasn't been heretofore.
So we have seen over the last 30 years, massive outsourcing of American but also European companies towards China. What we saw with the pandemic, this over-reliance, this over-dependence, did we learn any lessons from that? Or when we go back to normal in terms of post-pandemic world, we'll go back to business as usual?
What a great question. I think there will be some lessons learned and acted upon from the pandemic. I mentioned one, supply chain dependence, which will have a direct impact on manufacturing, because if you decide, we're going to have some of that capability here at home, whether it be here in Europe or in the United States, well, that means you're going to have to, seed some domestic manufacturing capacity to do that. But also manufacturing has changed. So you can bring back manufacturing to your home shores, but it's not the same. I can remember here in Germany, I came for the G7 meeting with then President Barack Obama. I had the privilege of coming with him to the G7 meeting here in Bavaria. And we...
10 kilometers from here.
Exactly. And we did a tour of the BMW plant in Munich. And I was stunned, because I've gone to a lot of auto manufacturing plants. And what I didn't see in the first 15 minutes of the tour was a human being. It is all automated. In fact, the only thing for humans to do was to monitor the computer screen and the fine undercoating wiring needed sort of the dexterity of the human fingers. But other than that, everything, painting, assemblage, you name it, was done by robots. And I thought, well, even if we bring back manufacturing to home shores, it doesn't necessarily mean all those jobs come back, or at least not the same kinds of skills that were required not so long ago in manufacturing. So, we need to understand that. There's still enormous promise, but that requires training and educational input and a skill set that was not the case
And maybe more resources
before.
for research and development.
Well, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So transatlantic, research and development, how we can get together and collaborate more.
And we need to find those opportunities, it seems to me, because as you point out, I mean, you look at those two economic behemoths and they really can, I think, create lots of synergies and go toe-to-toe with the Chinese.
My last question is regarding House Democracy Partnership. We're thrilled you're here with the congressional delegation to meet with parliamentarians for 5 different countries, both Western Balkans and Eastern Europe. You are also one of the champions in the US Congress that really is focusing on the importance of effective, strong, transparent, democratic institutions in nation states that you work with. Why is this work important?
I believe that history has shown that strong, vibrant democracies in the long run provide for and deliver for their people. And I also happen to believe that the desire for freedom is innate in the human being. I don't believe that it's culturally bound. I believe that somebody in Nanjing cares about free expression and the freedom of mobility and freedom to pick or choose a job or to get educated or to travel, to express themselves in terms of their religious belief system or their political dissent is very much as valid a desire as it is in, Garmisch, Germany. And that doesn't mean there aren't cultural differences. There are. And that there aren't different expressions of democratic will and intent. But I don't believe human beings' fate is to be controlled and constrained in very basic freedoms. And so I also believe that democracy to work, and given a chance, will provide, as I said, a quality of life that is, enviable from a historical point of view. And I think, certainly the United States has striven to try to do that. And I think we see it here in Europe. I mean, after World War II, all seemed lost. There was devastation. We're reeling from authoritarian dictatorial structures of government that had dominated the 30s and the 40s. And yet what we discovered was even that spark of freedom it had help with the Marshall Plan and other things. That's right. But it was predicated on the idea that a free people will actually rise to the occasion. And look at the success of Western Europe today. So I know there are people who think, no, it's culture bound, but that's not my experience all over the world. That a certain seed is planted when you become a human being to want to be free.
As you know, the Marshall Center was created in 1993 to strengthen, to foster democracy and rule of law and Western values in the former communist countries in Europe. And we continue to do that. We also work in raising capacities for members of parliament, because that's important to strengthen democracy in these countries. So we have very similar goals, House Democracy Partnership and the Marshall Center.
Yep.
How do you see that collaboration going forward?
I think there's a lot to be shared. In listening to what you said about, say, former communist societies or former Soviet satellite nations, you know, we're going to have, you know, bumps in the road because we don't have a vibrant civic society culture that's even, right? It was suppressed. And so trying to build a strong civic engagement it can be a challenge for some societies still. Trying to move away from autocratic instincts when you get power, trying to understand, and we're still struggling with this in our country, so we're not trying to lecture, but how do you understand the dialectic in terms of political opposition and respect it and commit fundamentally to the peaceful transfer of power when you lose an election? How do you collaborate with either a multi-party system or a bi-party system to move an agenda forward? These are challenges every democracy faces. And if you're in power and not used to any kind of democratic tradition in the last 50 or 100 years, there's an enormous temptation to say, well, you know what, why should I bother? We've got the power, we'll just use it. And that's a temptation to be resisted because in the long run, it costs. It costs your country, it costs your society, it costs the people you serve. So building those traditions, fostering them, strengthening them is what we can and must do. The House Democracy Project is committed to trying to work with willing parliaments who are committed to those precepts. And of course, what we're trying to do in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is the same in building a structural architecture committed to democratic resilience.
The Marshall Center has a large community, has a large network of more than 15,000 from 150 countries. If you had a piece of advice for them, what would that be?
I would say stay true to the democratic traditions that brought you here in the first place and to which you were exposed in more depth. Be builders of democratic society. Make sure that the institutions you go back to are protectors, defenders, and promoters of those democratic values because that's how we institutionalize freedoms and democratic societies.
Congressman Connolly, thank you very much. I was delighted to have you here.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me.